So today I'm going to take a look at this YouTube video by Susan Oliver from her Back to the Science channel. So we can see the title of the video is Lab Leak, a Conspiracy in Search of a Theory. So she's looking at where the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which caused COVID, might have originated from. So she clearly thinks the zoonotic spillover from the Wuhan wet market is the most plausible. But she also then looks at possible arguments for a lab leak, and here she's going to be looking at one of the arguments some people deploy, that it was an extreme coincidence that it happened to originate in a city where there is a lab studying bat coronaviruses. So she's certainly correct in that low probability events do occur, and we certainly couldn't use that as a definitive argument either way, although it could potentially be used as one piece of circumstantial evidence. So if we look at this snippet coming up, because she deploys a kind of argument from analogy, and I think the analogy is a little bit weak, although that doesn't necessarily undermine the principle that she's talking about.
And then there is this. It's a huge coincidence that SARS-CoV-2 emerged in a city where there was a lab studying coronaviruses. Now, before we talk about the SARS-CoV-2 coincidence, I would like to tell you about another suspicious coincidence. In 2013, there was an outbreak of a dangerous bacterial pathogen known as Pseudomonas aeruginosa at a hospital in Sydney. Well, it just so happens that our lab, which is also in Sydney, was working with the same pathogen. And here's some pictures that I took as proof. What are the chances of the outbreak occurring in the same city as a lab that was working on the pathogen? The chances are, in fact, very high, because Pseudomonas aeruginosa is a WHO priority pathogen. So there's a large number of labs all over the world working on it. And I can say absolutely that we had nothing to do with it, because the outbreak was a different strain.
So she states that this particular outbreak was in Sydney, and that there's a lab that was also studying this bacterium in Sydney. Now, I read up on this bacterium, and it seems actually that it is actually quite prevalent in the environment, but doesn't always lead to an outbreak. So she doesn't actually state how many labs there are in Australia that might be studying this. She says that there's a lot around the world, but I don't know whether that's just one in Australia or several. But when I looked at the population of Sydney, it's sort of just under 20% of the Australian population. So in terms of very crude odds, it's actually kind of slightly higher odds than rolling a dice and expecting any particular number to come up. It's kind of almost one in five. So I kind of understand the point that she's making, but it's maybe not a particularly good analogy. But if we look at it's a little bit more of the video where she talks about labs in China.
Source was traced to a contaminated sink. Well, it turns out that it's pretty similar when it comes to coronaviruses. Although people like to talk about the Wuhan Institute of Virology studying coronaviruses as something unique, this picture here, which was put together by Michael Warraby, shows that there's lots of cities in China where there were labs doing coronavirus research.
So this is quite interesting, this picture. So this actually kind of highlights 9 cities in China, and the implication is that each of these has got a lab or labs that were studying coronaviruses, and presumably ones that originated from bats, where SARS-CoV-2 is thought to have ultimately come from. Now, the interesting thing is, I actually looked up these academic papers that are linked to these cities. I couldn't actually find any evidence at all in these academic papers in some of the cities. There was actually a lab there, so I just picked a couple of obvious ones, or sorry, less obvious ones. So Shenyang and Shenzhen, and there's nothing in the papers or the in terms of what the paper was studying or where the authors are based and what they were studying to suggest it was actually a lab there. Now, I believe after doing a bit of a Google search, there might have been one in Beijing or Shanghai, uh, but certainly the rest of them, I've no idea what the evidence is from this diagram. I have asked in the comments to the video to if she can explain that, but so far I've not had a response. But even in terms of numbers, this is certainly not comparable to the bacterium that she talks about in Australia. So if you do a Google search, you'll see that there's over 700 cities in China, and there's over 40,000 wet markets. Now, I'm not too sure how many of those wet markets actually trade in live animals, where the risk of a zoonotic spillover would come from. But certainly the odds are quite different here than her analogy to the bacterium outbreak in Sydney, and it's not even clear from this diagram at all that there's actually labs in these 9 cities. Now, I'll certainly be interested if anybody could shed light on this. But I mean, obviously, like I've said already, a low probability event is not, is certainly not compelling evidence on its own of a lab leak. But if it's combined with other circumstantial evidence, it may lend some plausibility for that. But ultimately, I don't think we'll ever know the actual true origin of the virus, whether it was from the wet market or from the lab. But I think the moral of this story is, but just be careful when you deploy arguments from analogy, and also check your sources.